Murphy, the late Johnny Carson, and Seinfeld. Former newspaper columnist Otis Pike commented that, in his opinion, heroes in America are more likely to be people who help us to escape reality than to deal with reality. Actor Tom Selleck, I think, provides some illumination here. Selleck said this, and I'm quoting him: "In the scheme of things, I'm not as important as Dr. Jonas Salk." And who was Dr. Jonas Salk? Well, as most of you probably know, Dr. Jonas Salk was the inventor of the polio vaccine, a vaccine that has prevented millions of people, especially children, from contracting a lifelong paralyzing disease. The question, or at least one of the questions I raised last week, was this: in America, is entertaining people more likely to win one applause and hero status than fighting for social justice? Also, another question: how many Americans who would eagerly seek the autograph of an athlete or an entertainer would seek the autograph of a corporate or government whistleblower or someone else who has done outstanding work in fighting poverty and disease? And also, how many Americans' version of a tough guy or tough lady is of a person who is trying very hard to be decent in a world in which there is much evil? Aristippus, a famous Greek thinker of antiquity, provides some illumination here. He said this: "The most impressive spectacle in life is the sight of a virtuous person steadily pursuing his or her course in the midst of vicious people." I wonder how many Americans share Aristippus's perception. Or are Americans, by and large, more impressed with a very good singing voice or a terrific golf swing? What do you think? Over the centuries, heroes and heroines have often been people who have shown extraordinary courage. And on this subject of courage, historians and others point out that there are at least two kinds of courage. There is physical courage and there is moral courage. Indeed, sometimes, often, I think they go together. But let me provide the distinction. Physical courage, for example, might involve a fireman fighting a fire. I think it's accurate to say that fighting a fire requires a certain kind of courage. Or a policeman pursuing dangerous criminals. Or a soldier in battle, risking at the very least being wounded and at the worst being killed. I think it's fair to say all of those are examples of physical courage. On the subject of moral courage often involves standing up for what one believes when it is dangerous to do so. Examples of moral courage: political dissidents, for example, in totalitarian or racist countries, speaking out against the tyranny or the racism. For example, people such as Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov in the former Soviet Union, who criticized the tyranny of the communists in that country. Or Nelson Mandela in South Africa, speaking out against and protesting against the racist government in that country. And feminists all over the world, standing up to and criticizing male domination. Another example of moral courage, one I pointed out in my previous program: whistleblowers, corporate whistleblowers such as Jeffrey Wigand, the tobacco industry whistleblower. Or government whistleblower such as Frank Serpico, who in the 60s pointed out that there was much corruption in the New York City Police Department. Civil rights activists in the United States such as the Dr. and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Question: does moral courage often require physical courage? Well, think about this for a moment. Jesus displayed great moral courage, as did Lincoln, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr., and all knew they were risking their lives in doing so. And what was the fate that Jesus, Lincoln, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. met? Well, as you know, they were all killed. Is moral courage rarer than physical courage? Again, is moral courage rarer than physical courage? Are there physically brave soldiers and police officers and teachers and professors who would never risk being unpopular among their colleagues and supervisors by exposing corruption or at least gross inefficiency in the military, the police department, or education? Is it true that physical courage is often honored? For example, isn't it true that we often honor brave fire people and police people, and rightfully so? But isn't it also true that moral courage is often penalized? Indeed, isn't it true that moral courage can sometimes be an impediment to career advancement, and indeed could even result in one being killed? An example of moral courage perhaps being an impediment to career advancement. Do you think that a conscientious, good teacher who makes valid criticisms of the school system in which he is working or she is working and goes public with these criticisms, do you think such a good teacher, such a dedicated teacher, would be helping or hurting his or her chances for career advancement, again, by exposing some of the inefficiencies and maybe some of the ways in which the system isn't working well to the general public? What do you think? Again, the question, is moral courage rarer than physical courage? And I think the late Robert Kennedy, the brother of the former president of the United States, provides some illumination here. Kennedy has been quoted as saying the following: "Few men are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than courage in battle or even great intelligence. Yet, it is the one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change a world that yields most painfully to change." Is moral courage a vital quality for those who hope to bring about significant changes in the world? Moral courage involves a near certainty of becoming unpopular among certain groups of people. And as I said, it often involves putting one's life in danger. Let me give some historical examples of this. Socrates, more than 2,000 years ago, questioned the majority's way of thinking in ancient Athens. And he stimulated people's thinking about whether most people have wisdom. Socrates, in his conversations with his fellow Athenians, at the very least implied that most people don't have wisdom, that wisdom is quite rare among people. Socrates, of course, came to be disliked by many people. And what was his fate? Well, we know eventually he was forced to commit suicide by the government of ancient Athens. Jesus is another outstanding example of someone who showed great moral courage. Jesus criticized society's values. Jesus claimed that love, not wealth, status, or power, makes a person valuable. Indeed, Jesus claimed love is the highest law. Indeed, some scholars claim Jesus believed love was the only law. And what fate did Jesus beat? Well, we know, like Socrates, he also was executed. The 17th century scientist Galileo is another example of moral courage. Galileo, who himself was a devout Catholic, questioned both the Catholic Church and the Bible itself. Galileo, in the 1600s, claimed that the earth was not stationary and that the earth was not the center of the universe. This went counter to what the Catholic Church taught. This went counter to what the Catholic Church claimed the Bible taught. The Church claimed that the Bible was very clear on this, that the Bible claimed that the earth was the center of the universe and that it didn't move. Well, what happened to Galileo? Well, he was accused of religious heresy, indeed convicted by the Catholic Church of heresy and placed under house arrest. Centuries later, the Catholic Church admitted it had made a mistake, that Galileo was right. The Church claimed it had misinterpreted the Bible. Another example of moral courage is Thomas Jefferson. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson attacked traditional governments. We know that when Jefferson was alive, back in the 1700s and the 1800s, almost all governments in the world were monarchies. Kings, queens, for example, many of whom claimed divine right, many of whom claimed they got their power from God. Jefferson claimed that's nonsense, that a king or queen has gotten his power from God. And in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson claimed that legitimate governments get their power from the consent of the governed. Legitimate governments get their power from the consent of the governed. Jefferson, of course, came to be hated by the monarchs of Europe. And indeed, approximately 15 years after Jefferson penned those words in the Declaration of Independence, the people of France executed their king, Louis XVI. This, of course, sent a shudder through so many of the kings and queens in Europe, and one can be confident that many of them cursed Thomas Jefferson, believed he was at least partly responsible for his attacks, for what happened to the King of France, because again, Jefferson had attacked the notion that kings and queens had any legitimate right to rule other people. Also, another evidence of Jefferson's moral courage is that if America had lost the Revolutionary War to Great Britain, Jefferson almost certainly would have been hanged by the British as a traitor. Abraham Lincoln, of course, is also somebody who displayed enormous personal and moral courage. Lincoln claimed that slavery was immoral, one of the first leading politicians in America to say publicly that slavery was wicked. And of course, Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery in the United States. And when he was elected president, 7 southern states almost immediately seceded, that is, left the United States. They claimed they would rather form their own country than live under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. So that Lincoln came to be hated because of his stance concerning slavery, and of course, we know eventually was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, who was a proponent of slavery and who very much disliked Lincoln saying that slavery was evil. Some women who have exhibited enormous moral courage: Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, 2 of America's most famous feminists, who back in the late 1800s began speaking out against discrimination against women in America. Did you know that at one time in America, not only could women not vote, they couldn't go to college, They couldn't testify in court, and they couldn't even own property. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony promoted the idea that women should be given the right to vote. And again, they were doing this in the late 1800s. These women, these early feminists, were ridiculed, mocked, not only by men, but by many women. Many women had been conditioned to believe that it was only appropriate that just men should vote. And of course, in 1920, the Constitution was changed to give women the right to vote. So again, because of the efforts of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and feminists like them, women got the men in America to change the Constitution. Martin Luther King Jr. also is a superb example of somebody who showed great moral courage. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out against discrimination against black people and poor people in America. He attacked racial segregation and the fact that blacks were being prevented from voting. King claimed that this discrimination against black people violated the Declaration of Independence, violated the Constitution, and more importantly, violated God's law. King, of course, used nonviolence and only nonviolence to promote his agenda. Yet, despite the fact that nonviolence was his only weapon, he came to be hated by many people. And like Lincoln, like Jesus, like so many others who have exhibited moral courage in history, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Gandhi, another example of somebody who has shown much moral courage. Gandhi opposed British rule of India. But Gandhi also criticized his fellow Indians who were engaged in or involved in religious intolerance and social discrimination against other Indians. Gandhi, like Martin Luther King Jr., in fact, Gandhi preceded Martin Luther King Jr., as you know. He lived some years before King Jr. Indeed, Martin Luther King Jr. got many of his ideas from Gandhi. Again, Gandhi used nonviolence to promote his agenda, to get the British out of India, and to eliminate religious intolerance in India among the Indians. And again, what fate did Gandhi meet? Well, while he was loved by many, he was also hated by many, and like Jesus, Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi was assassinated. Nelson Mandela, another example of a person who evinced great moral courage. He opposed the unfairness of the white government of South Africa, a government which was engaging in political, social, and economic discrimination against black people. You might recall, in South Africa, in this country in Southern Africa, there was a system of apartheid whereby a small group of white people ruled a country inhabited mostly by black people. And Mandela, in opposing this discrimination against black people by the whites, came to be hated by many white people. And what fate did he meet? Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison in South Africa for his efforts to bring justice to South Africa. Anwar Sadat is an example of an Egyptian who showed great moral courage. Anwar Sadat was an Egyptian, an Arab, who signed a peace agreement with Israel. The idea was he thought it was about time that the Muslims and the Jews got along with each other. Sadat, again, the Egyptian president at the time, came to be hated by many of his own people for signing this peace agreement with Israel. And what was his fate? Anwar Sadat was assassinated by some of his own people. And indeed, some Israelis have been attacked by other Israelis for efforts to reach an accommodation with the Palestinians. On the subject of trying to do very good things in this world, medical doctor Albert Schweitzer, who spent more than 30 years treating the poorest of the poor, said this, and I think this quote is quite illuminating. Anyone who proposes to do good in this world must not expect people to roll stones out of his or her way, but rather accept his lot calmly if they even roll more stones upon his or her way. And Socrates, more than 2,000 years ago, said this: "It is not safe to oppose the many unjust acts in a society." He went on to say that truth-tellers are generally disliked. Here are Socrates' own words: "Do not be annoyed at my telling you the truth. The fact is that no man will come off safe who honestly opposes the many unjust and illegal doings in a society." And John Adams, the second president of the United States, said this: "Is it not strange and sad that simple integrity should have so many enemies?" And Shakespeare, in Macbeth has one of the characters say this: "In this earthly world, to do harm is sometimes praised. To do good is sometimes accounted dangerous folly." And Jesus, the great psychologist that he was, knew very well that people are often persecuted for doing good. And what did Jesus say? Here are his own words. This comes from the Sermon on the Mount. "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Psychologist M. Scott Peck provides some illumination on this subject and also some encouragement. What's the payoff for honest, truthful people? People who risk the disapproval of their peers and even risk their lives. Here are psychiatrist M. Scott Peck's own words: "Honest, truthful people can be secure and proud in the knowledge that they have not contributed to the confusion in this world, but rather have served as sources of illumination and clarification." Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, his masterpiece, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."